victim attorneys say that the release of Epstein, identifying of Epstein victims was one of the single most egregious violations of victim privacy in modern American history. You built your career on being a victim advocate.
Yeah.
Will you apologize to the victims? What do you have to say for that conduct?
Can you explain what you mean by identify? You mean victims' names that were released that shouldn't have been?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then
So
also other
yeah.
identifiers.
So under the Epstein Transparency Act, we had 30 days to redact and release under the law that was passed 3 million documents. If you stack those up, that's the height of the Eiffel Tower. No other administration, under the Biden administration, they released 0 documents. So we did our very best to comply with the law. And of course, we don't want any victim to be further victimized. And that's why we had 500 attorneys with the Criminal Division, with the National Security Division, with the FBI working around the clock to do the best we could. I think it was less than 1%.
What's happening? Guys, welcome back. Adam is here. So what just happened, guys? A federal magistrate judge put it in writing in a permanent court order that Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, violated a protective order. Not through a private slip or an honest mistake. She posted sealed information and a defendant's photograph on social media, publicly, deliberately, while serving as the nation's top law enforcement officer.
Attorney General Pam Bondi released a statement criticizing a federal district judge involved in the ongoing legal battle over the Trump administration's deportation flights involving Venezuelan non-citizens. Bondi said in part, quote, "This is another outrageous judicial power grab by an activist judge allowing unelected judges to usurp executive power is a fundamental threat to our democracy and the rule of law." That from the Attorney General. Bring in Scott McFarland. Scott, catch us up on where we are with this. There's politics and optics, which the administration believes are very much on its side. And then there are fundamental legal questions of what any administration can do to designate anyone in this country something that allows them to be swiftly deported and sent to another country.
This thing has been simmering, bubbling up. It feels like it's about to boil over now. This one singular dispute between the Trump administration and this chief judge here in Washington, James Boasberg, almost as if it's a proxy battle for something much larger. Will the administration honor court orders they disagree with?
The person whose name appears on every Department of Justice filing just told the entire country on her own platform that court orders are suggestions she can ignore when they become inconvenient. The case that triggered this confrontation involved an immigration-related assault prosecution. A magistrate judge, Judge Dulcie Foster, had issued a protective order sealing certain information about the defendant, a person named Nitzana Flores. The purpose of the order was twofold, and both purposes reflect fundamental principles of the American legal system.
First, a Wisconsin judge under arrest and facing charges accused of flouting federal law to help an illegal immigrant. Federal prosecutors say Milwaukee County Circuit Court Judge Hannah Dugan allegedly helped that migrant avoid arrest by ICE officers at the courthouse. It's a bizarre case and it's still unfolding. Hello, I'm John Roberts in Washington. Sandra, good to see you back again.
All right. Good to be back with you as well, John. I'm Sandra Smith in New York, and this is America Reports. So today's arrest of a judge marks the second such case in the last 24 hours. A former New Mexico judge and his wife were taken into custody yesterday. Federal agents arresting them for harboring a suspected Tren de Aragua gang member in their guest house.
First, the order protected the identities of law enforcement agents involved in the case. In sensitive prosecutions, particularly those with immigration dimensions that can inflame political passions, revealing which agents worked on the case can expose those agents to harassment, retaliation, or worse. Protective orders that seal agent identities are standard practice. They are not controversial. They are not political. They are the routine work of judges ensuring that the people who enforce the law can do their jobs without fearing for their safety or the safety of their families.
For more on all of this, we are honored to have in the new U.S. Attorney General, Pam Bondi. It's good to talk to you, Pam.
Good to talk to you.
So let me read a little bit from the criminal complaint here. And Judge Dugan says, despite having been advised of the administrative warrant for the arrest of Flores Ruiz, Judge Dugan then escorted Flores Ruiz and his counsel out of the courtroom through the jury door, which leads to a non-public area of the courthouse. A foot chase ensued. The agents pursued Flores Ruiz for the entire length of the courthouse and ultimately apprehended him. According to this complaint, Judge Dugan was visibly angry that ICE was there to arrest Flores Ruiz, even tried to kick the deportation agents out of the courthouse.
Yeah, and to set the stage for you and Sandra, this was truly horrific. This guy was in court being prosecuted by a state prosecutor for domestic violence battery. He had beat up two people, a guy and a girl, beat the guy, hit the guy 30 times, knocked him to the ground, choked him, beat up a woman so badly they both had to go to the hospital.
The order protected the presumption of innocence. This principle is so foundational to American jurisprudence that it is literally carved into the stone of courthouses across the country. A person accused of a crime is innocent until proven guilty. They are entitled to face their accusers in a court of law, to present a defense, to be judged by a jury of their peers based on evidence properly admitted under the rules of procedure. They are not entitled to be tried in the court of public opinion before they have had their day in actual court. They are not entitled to have their photograph broadcast by the highest law enforcement official in the land as a signal to the world that they are guilty before a single piece of evidence has been presented. Judge Foster's protective order was designed to preserve that presumption, to ensure that Nitzana Flores would receive a fair trial untainted by pre-trial publicity orchestrated by the government that was prosecuting her. Pam Bondi ignored all of this. She posted Flores's photograph on social media. She publicized the arrest. She took information that a federal judge had specifically ordered sealed and broadcast it to her followers as evidence of the administration's tough stance on immigration crime. And Judge Foster noticed. On a day in early spring, Judge Foster issued a written order that will follow Pam Bondi for the rest of her professional life. The order criticized Bondi in terms that federal judges rarely use against sitting attorneys general. Judge Foster called it a double standard. She pointed out that the protective order existed to safeguard the presumption of innocence, to prevent exactly the kind of public shaming that Bondi was engaging in. She said Bondi had violated the protective order, not may have violated. Not arguably violated, violated. The Attorney General of the United States, the chief law enforcement officer of the federal government, had broken a court order, and a federal judge had documented that violation in an official judicial ruling. Let the significance of that sink in for a moment. The Department of Justice under Pam Bondi's leadership is responsible for prosecuting people who violate court orders. Every day, in federal courthouses across America, assistant United States attorneys stand before judges and argue that defendants should be held in contempt, should face sanctions, should be incarcerated because they failed to comply with judicial orders. The entire edifice of federal law enforcement rests on the premise that court orders must be obeyed, that the rule of law means nothing if the people subject to judicial authority can simply ignore it when they find it inconvenient. And the person who leads that department, the person whose name appears above every prosecution for contempt of court, had just been formally rebuked by a federal judge for doing exactly what her own prosecutors argue should be punished. Bondi was not held in contempt. She was not arrested. She was not sanctioned financially or otherwise. The judge's criticism was contained in a written order that rebuked her conduct, but stopped short of imposing formal punishment. And after the order issued, Bondi adjusted her social media post. She complied, belatedly and grudgingly, with the order she had previously ignored. But the damage was already done. The pattern was already established. The message had already been sent to every federal judge, every defense attorney, every prosecutor, and every observer of the American legal system. The Attorney General of the United States believes she is above court orders. She will follow them only when caught and criticized, not as a matter of institutional duty or professional ethics. And if the top law enforcement officer in the country operates that way, then what possible basis exists for expecting anyone else to respect judicial authority? The timing of Bondi's violation and the subsequent judicial rebuke places this episode within a much larger pattern of Trump administration defiance of the courts. Around the same period, Judge Boasberg was threatening the administration with contempt over its deportation policies. The administration had been moving forward with immigration enforcement actions that federal judges had specifically blocked. They were treating injunctions as obstacles to be circumvented rather than commands to be obeyed. Judge Boasberg warned that continued defiance would result in contempt findings, and the administration's response was essentially to shrug, to continue doing what it wanted, to act as though the judicial branch had no real power to constrain executive action. The Bondi protective order violation fits perfectly within this pattern. Same attitude, same disregard. Same belief that court orders apply to other people, but not to the Trump administration. This attitude represents a fundamental threat to the constitutional structure. The separation of powers depends on each branch respecting the authority of the others. The executive branch enforces the laws that Congress passes. The judicial branch interprets those laws and ensures they are applied constitutionally. When the executive branch refuses to comply with judicial orders, it is not merely being difficult or obstructionist. It is attacking the foundation of democratic governance. A government in which the executive can ignore the judiciary is not a government of laws. It is a government of men, of raw power, of whatever the person holding the presidential seal decides to do on any given day. And when the Attorney General, the person specifically charged with representing the United States in legal matters, demonstrates through her own conduct that she does not respect judicial authority, she is signaling to every subordinate in the Department of Justice, every United States attorney, every federal law enforcement agent, that they too can ignore court orders when those orders conflict with administration priorities. The presumption of innocence dimension of this episode deserves particular attention because it reveals something important about how the Trump administration views defendants in the criminal justice system. The protective order Bondi violated was designed in part to protect Nitzana Flores from being publicly branded as guilty before trial. Bondi's social media post did exactly what the order was designed to prevent. She put Flores's face before the public in the context of an arrest announcement that carried the implicit message that Flores was a criminal who deserved to be locked up. The Attorney General of the United States, the person whose department would be prosecuting Flores, essentially declared her guilty in the court of public opinion before the actual court had heard a single piece of evidence. And the fact that this occurred in an immigration case is not coincidental. The Trump administration has built its political identity around the demonization of immigrants. The narrative is simple and brutal. Immigrants are criminals, they are dangerous, they must be rounded up and removed. When the Attorney General posts the photograph of an immigrant defendant before trial, she is feeding that narrative. She is using the power of her office to reinforce the message that immigrants do not deserve the same protections, the same presumption of innocence, the same due process that citizens receive. Judge Foster recognized this dynamic and called it out explicitly. She said it was a double standard. Prosecutors are supposed to follow the rules. They are supposed to respect protective orders. They are supposed to safeguard defendants' rights. But Bondi acted as though those rules did not apply to her, as though her political agenda justified ignoring judicial commands. And that double standard is at the heart of everything wrong with the Trump administration's approach to law enforcement. Rules are for other people. Court orders are for other people. The presumption of innocence is for other people. For the administration and its loyalists, the only thing that matters is advancing the political agenda, and any legal obstacle that gets in the way can be ignored, circumvented, or simply trampled. The aftermath of Bondi's judicial rebuke took a turn that is entirely consistent with how the Trump administration operates. She was fired. Not immediately, but within weeks of the judge's order criticizing her conduct. The termination came on the first day of April, roughly a month after Bondi had been caught violating the protective order and formally rebuked by Judge Foster. The administration did not publicly connect the firing to the court order violation. Trump rarely explains his personnel decisions in any detail, and when he does, the the explanations often shift depending on the audience and the moment. But the timing is difficult to ignore. Bondi violated a court order. A judge called her out in writing, and then she was gone, replaced, discarded like so many other Trump appointees who discovered that their loyalty to the president did not protect them from the consequences of their own mistakes. The question of why Trump fired Bondi matters less than what the firing reveals about the nature of service in this administration. Perhaps Trump was genuinely embarrassed that his attorney general had been publicly rebuked by a federal judge. Perhaps Republican senators, already nervous about the administration's pattern of court defiance, pressured him to replace her with someone who would at least maintain the appearance of respecting judicial authority. Perhaps the firing was completely unrelated to the protective order violation and stemmed from some other failure or disagreement that has not yet become public. But regardless of the specific reason, the pattern is clear. Trump uses people and then discards them. He demands absolute loyalty and offers none in return. He expects his appointees to take risks, to push boundaries, to do whatever is necessary to advance his agenda. And when those risks result in negative publicity, when the boundary pushing attracts judicial rebuke, when the appointee becomes a liability rather than an asset, they are gone. Bondi violated a court order to advance the administration's immigration narrative. She got caught, she got criticized, and then she got fired. The broader implications of this episode extend far beyond the career trajectory of one attorney general. Every federal judge who reads about Bondi's violation and the subsequent lack of meaningful consequences will understand that the Department of Justice under Trump does not consider itself bound by court orders in the way that previous administrations did. Every defense attorney representing a client in federal court will argue that the government cannot demand compliance with protective orders when its own leadership ignores them. Every prosecutor who stands before a judge seeking contempt sanctions against a defendant will face questions about why the same standard should not apply to their own superiors. The institutional damage that Bondi's conduct inflicted on the Department of Justice cannot be measured solely by the content of Judge Foster's written order. It must be measured by the erosion of the department's credibility, the diminishment of its moral authority, and the signal it sends to every actor in the federal legal system that the rules apply differently depending on who you are and who you work for. The contempt threat from Judge Boasberg that coincided with Bondi's protective order violation illustrates how these episodes compound each other. When judges see an attorney general who ignores protective orders, they become less willing to accept assurances from other administration officials that they will comply with other court orders. When the pattern of defiance becomes undeniable, judges escalate their responses. They issue sharper warnings. They impose stricter deadlines. They threaten contempt more readily. And each escalation, each sharper warning, each stricter deadline creates new opportunities for the administration to defy, new confrontations between the branches, new tests of whether the judiciary can actually enforce its authority against an executive that does not respect it. The constitutional crisis that many legal scholars have warned about is not a single dramatic event. It is not a moment when tanks roll into the streets or when the president openly declares that he will no longer recognize judicial authority. It is a slow accumulation of episodes like Bondi's protective order violation, each one small enough to be dismissed as an isolated incident, each one excused by loyalists as the inevitable friction of a bold executive pushing against an obstructionist judiciary. But taken together, across months and across cases and across different judges and different legal contexts, these episodes paint a picture of an administration that has fundamentally rejected the premise that the executive branch is bound by judicial orders. And when enough episodes accumulate, when the pattern becomes undeniable, the constitutional structure begins to crack. Not all at once, not with a dramatic collapse, but gradually, incrementally, until one day we look up and realize that the judiciary can no longer constrain the executive in any meaningful way. The firing of Bondi adds another layer to this picture. It demonstrates that even those who carry out the administration's defiance are not safe from its capriciousness. Bondi did what the administration wanted. She used her platform to advance the immigration narrative. She ignored a court order that interfered with that narrative. She took the hit when the judge rebuked her. And then, when the negative publicity accumulated, when she became more useful as a scapegoat than as an attorney general, she was discarded. The message to every other official in the administration is unmistakable. You will be expected to push boundaries, to test limits, to defy courts when necessary. But if you get caught, if the defiance attracts too much attention, if you become a liability rather than an asset, you will be on your own. The president will not protect you. The administration will not stand behind you. You will be fired, replaced, and forgotten. The lack of meaningful consequences for Bondi's violation compounds the problem. She violated a court order. A judge criticized her. She adjusted her social media post, and that was it. No contempt finding, no sanctions, no fine, no requirement that she personally appear before the judge to explain herself. The system essentially told the Attorney General of the United States that she could violate a protective order with near impunity, that the worst consequence she would face was a written rebuke that she could ignore once she had made the required adjustment to her social media presence. And if that is the consequence for violating a court order, then why would anyone in the administration hesitate to violate another one? Why would they comply with an injunction that blocks a deportation policy when the cost of defiance is merely a judicial opinion criticizing their conduct? Why would they respect a protective order in the next case when Bondi's experience demonstrates that violations carry no real penalty? The immigration context of Bondi's violation is not incidental to understanding its significance. The Trump administration has made immigration enforcement the centerpiece of its domestic agenda. The narrative that immigrants are criminals, that they pose a threat to American communities, that they must be removed aggressively and without the procedural protections that citizens enjoy, is not merely a policy preference. It is the animating idea behind much of what the administration does. When the Attorney General posts the photograph of an immigrant defendant in defiance of a protective order, she is not merely violating a judicial command. She is enacting the administration's core belief that immigrants do not deserve the same rights, the same protections, the same presumption of innocence that the legal system affords to others. The protective order existed to protect Flores from being publicly branded as guilty before trial. Bondi's violation of that order was an assertion that Flores, as an immigrant defendant, was not entitled to that protection. The Attorney General of the United States was announcing, through her conduct, if not her words, that some defendants are less equal than others, that some people can be publicly shamed before trial, because they are the kind of people the administration has decided deserve shaming. Judge Foster's rebuke recognized this dynamic and rejected it. By calling Bondi's conduct a double standard, Judge Foster was saying that the rules apply equally to everyone, that the Attorney General does not get to decide which defendants receive the presumption of innocence and which do not, that protective orders bind the government just as they bind defendants. But Judge Foster's rebuke, however well-reasoned and however clearly stated, could not undo the damage Bondi's post had already done. Flores's photograph was already circulating. The implicit declaration of guilt had already been made. The court of public opinion had already rendered its judgment. And the Attorney General, having made her point and taken her rebuke, simply adjusted her social media presence and moved on. The broader political context surrounding Bondi's violation and subsequent firing is essential to understanding why this episode matters beyond the narrow legal question of protective order compliance. The Trump administration is facing accountability pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Impeachment discussions are occurring with increasing frequency and seriousness. The 25th Amendment is being invoked by critics who argue the president is unfit for office. The War Powers Resolution has challenged the president's unilateral military actions. The Epstein files release has exposed connections the administration would prefer remained hidden. And through all of this, the administration's response has been consistent: defy, deny, attack the accusers, question the legitimacy of the institutions seeking accountability. Bondi's protective order violation fits perfectly within this strategy. A court issued an order that interfered with the administration's preferred narrative. Bondi ignored the order. When called out, she made a minimal adjustment and moved on. The institution attempting to enforce the rule of law, in this case Judge Foster's court, was treated as an obstacle to be circumvented rather than a coordinate branch of government whose commands must be respected. The long-term consequences of this pattern are difficult to overstate. Future administrations, regardless of party, will inherit a Department of Justice whose credibility has been damaged by Bondi's conduct and the conduct of her predecessors in the Trump administration. Future attorneys general will face skepticism from judges who remember that their recent predecessors treated court orders as optional. Future defendants will argue that the government cannot demand compliance with protective orders when its own leadership has demonstrated contempt for them. The institutional damage done by episodes like Bondi's protective order violation accumulates over time, eroding the foundations of trust and respect that make the legal system function. Rebuilding that trust will take years, perhaps decades, and will require sustained commitment from future administrations to demonstrating that they respect judicial authority even when they disagree with particular rulings. The question of what accountability should look like for conduct like Bondi's is one that the legal system has not adequately answered. She violated a court order. The judge criticized her. She adjusted her conduct, and that was the end of it. But is that really accountability? Is a written rebuke sufficient when the violator is the Attorney General of the United States, the person whose name appears on every contempt filing the Department of Justice submits to federal courts? If an ordinary citizen violated a protective order in a federal case, they would face contempt proceedings. They might be fined. They might be incarcerated until they purged themselves of contempt. The disparity between how the system treats ordinary litigants who violate court orders and how it treated Pam Bondi is stark and indefensible, and that disparity itself erodes respect for the rule of law because it demonstrates that the system does not, in fact, treat everyone equally. The firing of Bondi adds a political accountability dimension to the story, but political accountability is not the same as legal accountability. Trump fired her, but not because she violated a court order. He fired her because she became a liability, because the negative publicity outweighed whatever utility she still provided. The firing does not vindicate the principle that court orders must be obeyed. It does not send a message that the administration respects judicial authority. It merely demonstrates that Trump will discard anyone who becomes inconvenient, regardless of how loyally they served him. The next Attorney General will understand that their job security depends not on following the law or respecting courts, but on avoiding negative publicity and remaining useful to the president. That is not a recipe for restoring respect for the rule of law. It is a recipe for more episodes like Bondi's protective order violation, more defiance of courts, more erosion of the constitutional structure. The path forward from here is uncertain. The courts can continue issuing orders and hoping the executive branch complies. Congress can continue holding hearings and issuing subpoenas. The public can continue expressing outrage at each new episode of defiance. But unless there are genuine consequences, unless someone in a position of authority is actually held accountable for violating court orders, the pattern will continue. The executive branch will keep pushing boundaries. The judiciary will keep issuing rebukes that carry no real weight. And the constitutional structure will keep eroding, slowly, incrementally, until one day we discover that it can no longer perform its essential function of constraining executive power. Bondi's protective order violation is a small episode in the grand sweep of American legal history. But it is precisely these small episodes, accumulated over time, that determine whether the rule of law survives or crumbles. And the signs, at least for now, are not encouraging.